welcome to We Never Met, the podcast where I have an interesting stranger on every single week. And today we got...
John Gurda.
How are you?
Pretty good.
Yeah.
An interesting stranger.
Yeah, one of the interesting strangers. It is scorching today.
Yeah, it is 91.
Yeah. The first, at least, has it been the first over 90?
I think we may have hit it once or twice.
Okay.
Yeah, but maybe not here in Bayview, maybe a little bit farther west.
Yeah. And so where would people know you from, mostly?
Mostly Milwaukee history. I've been doing it for 47 years, 48 years, something like that.
Sure.
Books and TV stuff.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much what I do.
And it's, or at least you said that you kind of got into it by accident.
Right.
So what is that story? How did you accidentally get into?
Very basically, I was an English major in college, went to Boston College, and liked poetry, and but did not have any interest in going on for an advanced degree. By that time, I felt like I was sort of killing butterflies and pinning them onto boards, all that kind of critical analysis stuff.
Yeah.
So I came home after graduation in '69. This is back in the late '60s, and if you weren't part of the solution, you were part of the problem. I had a friend who was directing very, kind of early in his career, Frank Miller, a youth center called Journey House on the near south side, and I came down there as a volunteer and ended up staying for 3 years as a staff member, associate director.
Wow!
So it was really a switch from kind of being in kind of the English major's head stuff to being kind of in an inner city, youth situation, young people situation.
Yeah.
And we were very much a hand-to-mouth operation, and a Vista volunteer and I, a guy named Byron Anderson, decided to write what would be basically kind of in some ways, you call it a case statement today, isn't it? Fundraising terms.
Sure.
But back then it was just a narrative about kind of what the neighborhood's needs were and how we were attempting to address them.
Sure.
So that resulted in a little publication, very primitive, called The Near South Side, A Delicate Balance.
Oh, okay.
And during the research for that, I decided, for reasons I don't have any inkling, where they came from,
Sure.
why I chose that tack, but I chose the historical portion. What happened basically is that while I was doing the research for that publication, I began to discover sort of connections with my own history, which is South Side. I was raised around Jackson Park, then out in Hales Corners. My grandparents had a hardware store on 32nd and Lincoln for 50 years. So I was only, 2 miles away, from my childhood haunts.
Yeah.
So I began to see the intersection of my story with the city story, with the nation story, with history. And I said before that back in the 60s, it was a time that was pretty much anti-historical. It was always focused on the new, kind of throwing out anything that was over 30, among other things.
Sure.
And trying to sort of erect a counterculture. So it was really kind of making a 180 and kind of going back to the past as kind of the source of everything in the present and the future. So in that sense, it was accidental. It was not something that I sat down with a career counselor or did a personality test and said you're well positioned to be a historian. It was just following my nose. And that led to another job with United Way, doing research on a neighbor a little bit farther west in the south side.
Okay.
And one thing led to another. I went on and got a master's in cultural geography. I did my master's thesis on Jones Island, historical geography of Jones Island. And that began back in 1971 was the time Delicate Balance came out. So it's been a long time.
Yeah. So what do you think it is specifically about history? Like you said, it ties in your own, experience with the experiences of whatever has happened in the city. But what do you think, what did you want to be before? Like what before that point hit?
Kind of a raggedy ass poet. If I had an aspiration, that would have been it.
Yeah.
I did not have career aspirations when I went to college. I was interested in politics early on. I was a Goldwater Republican in 1964.
Okay.
Around the time of Kennedy, which is a real, just really kind of contrasting optics there. I was sort of attracted to Kennedy, but for some reason, I have no idea why. I believed in Goldwater. That didn't last all that long. Certainly not through high school, or not through college. So it was not, again, so the late 60s, which were not, career-driven would not be the term to describe what was going on back in the 1960s.
Sure. And even before that, so you said you grew up here.
Right.
So what was your childhood like? Like, what was growing up like for you here?
It was a little cuspy in terms of old and new.
Okay.
In my earliest memories, first 8 years were in the Leighton Park neighborhood, which is kind of an old Polish-German neighborhood on the south side. We were on a street, South 34th Street, with a lot of teens and 20s housing, a lot of Poles and Germans. Looking back, I had no idea back then.
Yeah, sure.
And things had been brought to a standstill by the Depression and World War II, and my dad bought a little lot on 34th, and for $6,000, it was a lot in a little prefab house. He would later on call them cracker boxes. They're still small, that post-war housing stock.
Sure.
But we walked to the hardware store, we walked to the branch library, Forest Home Avenue. We'd walk to Jackson Park, which is just a great green space. So in that sense, it was kind of an older Milwaukee. When I was 8, we moved to Hales Corners to a former cow pasture on Brookside Drive, and that was very typical 1950s, 60s suburban. The kind of thing you would have with the Leave It to Beaver and the Top 40. Kind of the same culture. Americans would have been absorbed in from California to Rhode Island.
Yeah. Did you enjoy that? Like, did you enjoy that upbringing? And like looking back now, I mean, obviously when you were there, you didn't really have a choice.
Yeah.
Right.
You're like a fish in the goldfish bowl saying, am I having fun yet?
But looking back, was that something that you enjoyed, or would you have chosen, if you could, I guess, some other sort of?
I think I enjoyed it, and part of I like having that connection with the old Milwaukee, because that informs a lot of what I've been doing ever since.
Right.
I also like in Hales Corners, the open spaces of Whitnell Park, and being able to get in a bike and go wherever we pleased. Playing baseball just about every single day in the summer in vacant lots. And that was a nice way to grow up. What it lacked was diversity. I didn't know any black people until college, and then barely. So it really was very much a European, kind of a background that I was raised with. And specifically in my case, my family's Polish on my dad's side, and that was the hardware store on Lincoln. That was a real kind of a landmark touchstone, for everybody in my family. And my mother was from a dairy farm in southwestern Wisconsin. So she was Norwegian. Her dad's name was John Johnson. And in the town of La Crosse, around a little town called Coon Valley. So I had a sense of connection through them with things that were older, but it was not diverse, and it was also being raised reflexively Catholic, which is kind of very much the Polish. My mom converted, when she got married. They met during World War II, and the Catholic Church in those pre-Vatican days was pretty high-bound, doctrinaire, rigid. There's a lot going on, not all of it savory, beneath the surface. At the same time, there was an expectation of living a life with meaning, living a life that had some aspect of service, and those have stayed with me. So it's life. It's always kind of darkness and light.
Did your parents come here from somewhere, or
no,
were they born in Wisconsin
my dad was born my dad was born above the hardware store. So he was born there back in 1911. My mom was raised in her dad was born in Norway, came as a kid. My dad's dad was born in Poland, came as a kid. So I'm third generation.
Yeah. So I guess spending most of your life in Wisconsin, you got to see, in Milwaukee specifically, you got to see kind of it change a lot, I'm sure. Was there a specific time period for you that you enjoyed the most in Milwaukee, like seeing the city specifically?
Part of it is that you remember and value things in terms of where you are, in terms of your age. So the 50s were, in a lot of ways, that was a fairly, looking back retroactively, this is a fairly carefree time. Certainly we had the threat of the bomb, the fallout shelters were kind of in the news, Cuban Missile Crisis.
Sure.
But there was an innocence to that time, that we've since lost. In terms of, a time in Milwaukee's history, during my lifetime, just seeing the multiple renaissances downtown has been kind of fun. Kind of see that being remade again.
Sure.
It's just remarkable. I remember there was, back in the 80s, there was a big burst of development then, and somebody in Milwaukee Magazine said, "No, now Milwaukee's downtown is finally done." No. Cities are never ever done.
Yeah.
And I've also, I think, after the '60s, and I was part of that movement. There was that a disavowal of the past, an embrace of the new.
What do you mean by that?
In the years before the '60s, or in the '60s, it worked both ways. For my parents' generation, a lot of it was kind of turning your back on the city and moving to the suburbs. That's where the grass was greener.
Sure.
So that was a disavowal of what they felt to be back then. Kind of these out of date neighborhoods. That had not been. Seen a lot of reinvestment because of the Depression of World War II, 15 years. I mean, no one's building, no one's fixing up.
Yeah.
And then my generation, kind of took that even further and kind of rejected the whole cultural heritage of the Western world. So it was a fairly broad, kind of a retreat. So seeing in more of the 70s and the 60s, seeing kind of the rediscovery of ethnicity, the historic preservation movement, the revaluing of old neighborhoods. So that's been very positive.
Yeah.
I'd love to see that.
Yeah. So do you think, since you've been here for such a long time, do you think Milwaukee, like the culture and growing up here, has shaped you in a certain way?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
How do you think it has, like, specifically?
In terms of specific Milwaukee kind of values, I drink beer. I don't drink cocktails. I like to spend time outdoors. The park system here, gives you a great opportunity to do just that. Sometimes Milwaukeeans are criticized for looking at our feet too much, especially in contrast to Chicago. But from my point of view, that gives Milwaukee a groundedness. Nobody puts on airs, in Milwaukee. It's pretty much what you see is what you get kind of town. I mean, not a lot of posing, not a lot of posturing, and I like that authenticity.
Yeah,
always have. But I think I'm a product of that as well.
Yeah. So, and then from this kind of love of history, and you started writing books. So what was the first book you wrote when you kind of decided that you wanted to go down like a writing and more historical route?
I had no aspirations to write books. Like, again, I was just following my nose. That Delicate Balance came out in '71. I did a couple of projects for United Way. Did a really, really crappy book about Waukesha County for United Way.
Why was it crappy?
It was just awful. It was just terrible. It was sad. It was primitive research, sort of obvious conclusions. And that's when I realized that, as I said, Milwaukee Magazine did a story a while back. I said, realized I did not know my ass from my elbow. And that was true. That was absolutely true. So I went back and got a master's in '78. And then after that, I got hired by a program at EWM funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And part of the program was to develop an encyclopedia of Milwaukee neighborhoods.
Okay.
And that's kind of what I was doing. So that was kind of my charge in that project. And back in 1979, wrote a book called Bayview, Wisconsin. And followed that with a book called The West End in 1980, which was about Pigsville, Merrill Park, and Concordia up on the near west side, around 35th in Wisconsin. And those were the first real books, not long, 100, 125 pages, but the first kind of sustained effort, for me. And that Bayview book sold about 5,000 copies.
Wow.
It's been out of print for a long time. Groppy's Market sold about 1,000. So,
oh, really?
So it was very grassroots and very intentionally. It was just filled with quotes from interviews, and the quotes were all in bold. So that was quite on purpose. Giving the community a voice.
Yeah. So what has been a neighborhood that you really enjoy covering? What is?
They're all interesting. It's like studying people. Everybody has his or her own story. Yep.
Yeah.
But Bayview is my favorite neighborhood. I've been here since 1978.
Yeah.
So it's kind of I describe Bayview as a part of the city, apart from the city. It's got its own history. It was once a company town, was once a suburb. And it still has a strong sense of place built around that iron mill that used to stand at the south end of the Danholm Bridge, from 1868 to 1929. And it has, this kind of a sort of a laid back vibe. I've described Bayview as the South Side's East Side.
Okay.
It's both physically and culturally. So they'll drag me out of here feet first. But there's a lot of, Milwaukee has a lot of sound and interesting neighborhoods.
What is the sort of, I guess you probably go on forever about it, but like what is the sort of abridged history of Bayview?
1868, an iron mill was located here, and it made railroad rails. The second largest maker of railroad rails in the country. Had about 1,500 workers in the 1870s, and it was beyond the edge of settlement in Milwaukee because it needed so much space, and they also wanted to control kind of their own affairs. So they incorporated as the village of Bayview back in 1879. Okay. And by the next few years, Milwaukee kind of grew out to meet the suburb, and in 1887, Bayviewites voted to consolidate with Milwaukee. Okay. So it's been a neighborhood ever since 1887.
Okay.
But as I said many times, it was like getting married and keeping your name. This is still Bayview.
Yeah.
Very much Bayview.
Yeah. And so I guess over the course of all these, you wrote a book that eventually got turned into a TV show.
Yeah, Making of Milwaukee.
Yeah, and it won an Emmy.
Right.
So what was the process of, was that the first ever adaptation into other medias that you had?
I'd done some script work for Channel 10, Milwaukee PBS,
Sure.
But that was by far the largest. And where that came from was the Making of Milwaukee. The book came out in 1999, and that was, by that time I'd been writing pretty much. I began to work on that back in about 95. So it had been 20 years by that time almost. I'd done a number of commissioned works, some corporations, some churches, Forest Home Cemetery, so it's interesting assignments. And that's been really important, I would not have been able to support myself or my family, if I'd been strictly, grant work and sort of nonprofit stuff, kind of hoping, for sales on the other end. So done a number of commissions, and what I felt was, I'd assembled enough pieces of the puzzle that I felt almost an obligation to sort of finish it.
Yeah.
And I thought it'd be pretty easy. It was not. It was really hard because I had to. What I did was I kind of assigned myself the task of telling Milwaukee's story from the beginning to. Then, back in '99 when it came out, so that was 4 years of work. That was just about all I did. For 4 years, and that came out, and it was what it did, and a lot of it was there was a vacuum in the market. There had not been good, not even using the word good, but a relatively complete history of Milwaukee since 1948.
Oh wow!
So there really was, kind of a gap, and that was a really good book, Baird Still's Milwaukee: The History of a City, but it was very long and sort of tough sledding. Good book, but not something the general reader would pick up.
Yeah,
and not many pictures either. So what the book did is it became kind of the, if only by default, the general history of Milwaukee.
Sure.
Since then, now it's in the fourth edition. We did the last update in December of 2018, and it's up to about 28,000 copies. Which is doing pretty well for a local title. And I knew even before the book was completely done and being accepted that I needed to tell this story in a way that was more broadly accessible than print.
Sure.
So Channel 10 was enthusiastic about it. Went out and raised the money, and that took another close to 4 years. working with a woman named Claudia Luz, lived in Bayview at the time, and just a very gifted director, editor, producer, and the crew, Channel 10. And that came out in 2006 and won an Emmy the next year. It's 5 hours. It's a 5-hour series.
Yeah.
We updated that, added a half hour. We'll update in 2016, the 10-year anniversary. And this still has some legs, they still pledge that, they put that on pledge drives and use it in the schools. So that's been, it's been gratifying. And it's still a lot of what really makes that show work. We had a through written soundtrack, written by Maurice Wininski, who was a bassist for the Milwaukee Symphony, and just seamless, just hand in glove, it really made that piece sing.
Yeah. What do you think it is now? I guess maybe this is just my personal experience too, but like I am very, very fascinated in, for example, we're in a house right now, like what this looked like 100 years ago or 200 years ago, or what was here. Where do you think that comes from in people?
I think the historical imagination has always been a facet of being human.
Yeah.
I think people thousands, millennia, ago, are kind of looking back at the way things had been. Because we're not here for that long.
Yeah.
And you kind of, just as you're curious about the future, kind of what our generations, what my granddaughter in the backyard, what she's going to experience, as an older adult. That's fascinating. You also look back and just the contrasts, the pace of change has been so fast,
right?
Especially in the more recent decades. It's fascinating to try to time travel and kind of go back to, try to at least imagine kind of what life was like. But the more important thing for me, and I think it's another part of that historical imagination, is I've used this line time and again, but history is why things are the way they are. So you really can't understand, kind of where Bayview or Milwaukee or the world is in 2019 without having some notion of where it's been. Otherwise, you're suffering from amnesia.
Yeah. So when you do research, is there specific decades that are easier to find like information about? Like, is there certain decades in history that was like people didn't decide to record things?
Yeah, the very early stuff can be a little fugitive. In Milwaukee's case, that's 1830s, 40s. There's some really good primary materials. Letters of Solomon Juneau, Byron Kilbourne, fur trader records, ethnographies of Indian tribes. Some of that stuff's very powerful. And the late 1800s are a pretty rich period. Some good history is written then. And there's just a completely addictive newspapers database. It's just called 19th Century Newspapers. Okay. And every issue of the Milwaukee, it's national, so they had scores of papers. But the Milwaukee has good coverage with the Milwaukee Sentinel, which goes back to 1837.
Wow, really?
So you can go from 1837 to the end of 1899. If you have a library card, you can access it online remotely and look up anything you want. So it's searchable.
Wow.
So you look up, Gurda, horse thief, or something like that, and you can find just some wonderful stuff. When I was working on the Jewish history, I just used Jewish as a keyword. Jewish as a keyword. Came up with 5,000 hits. And some of that stuff had not been seen, since the time it was printed. So there's really good coverage, and a lot of the stuff sort of fell by the wayside. But there's a lot there for the 19th century, 20th as well. Some of the newspaper stuff, some of that access is hit and miss. The more recent past is the hardest because we're too close to see it in a lot of ways, and also because the primary sources tend to be newspapers, and those are indexed, the Journal Sentinel from 1990 on, so you can find things there. But it's a little more, it's more shapeless. There hasn't been as much interpretation. Some good theses and dissertations. A lot of stuff out there. Photographs, and a lot of stuff I do is visual. There's something with 2,000 pictures in Making Milwaukee and the City of Neighbors combined. The photographs are it's a limited menu, but there's a lot of them for the earlier period.
Okay.
In the more recent past, partly it's digital, so that stuff.
Yeah.
Where that's going to be in somebody in my position 50 years from now,
Yeah.
that might be difficult.
Yeah.
Might be a challenge. Certainly there are archivists, who are working on that problem every single day of their lives. But
Yeah.
Photographs, certainly, I think they'll probably have a better chance of being found than a lot of the communications. I mean, emails,
Yeah.
all that stuff's kind of, how do you find that trail?
Yeah. So when you were like researching, I guess this is kind of taking it back, when you were initially researching and looking into like Milwaukee, I guess generally, was there something you came across or something that you found that like really hit a chord with you for some reason, like, and really made you more interested in researching and like, wow, oh my, I did, like maybe it even like was something related to how you grew up or a place around you?
No, if there was kind of an epiphany, it was the sense of the importance of socialism in Milwaukee.
Yeah.
And I knew about it. It's kind of, you learn that if you do even basic stuff about Milwaukee.
Yeah.
But we had socialist mayors most of the years between 1910 and 1960. And the revelation was kind of what they stood for and how much they got done. Now it's become kind of the S word, in American politics.
Sure.
But these guys, and women, it was both genders. They were phenomenal governors. They were not tax and spend types. They believed in public enterprise, believed in efficiency, believed in economy, believed in creativity, diligence, and the legacy they've left, among other things. Those years of public enterprise, the public park system is probably the single greatest legacy. Milwaukee County has 15,000 acres of public green space, which is 5 times per capita more than Chicago has.
Oh, wow.
And that's just the socialists.
Yeah.
It's entirely because of them.
Yeah, because Milwaukee had the last socialist mayor
Yeah.
in the United States.
Yeah, Frank Zeidler, he preferred to say the most recent.
Yeah. The most recent, yeah.
Yeah, he stepped down in 1960. He was a friend and kind of a hero for me. He died at 91 back in 06, and we would sort of team teach, these sort of one-off sessions, and it would be Milwaukee labor, Milwaukee politics, Milwaukee industry, Milwaukee ethnic groups. We get 100, 125 people.
Yeah,
and that was a lot of fun. Really enjoyed that.
So are there a lot of people now that are kind of doing this as well? Like, is there a movement as well with more people that are interested in history and writing about it? Has there been like a critical mass of historians ever, like where it kind of got to a point where there was
in Milwaukee?
Just generally, yeah. Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
I don't know. I wouldn't say the field is crowded.
Okay.
There's enough over the years. There's been enough work in this town for maybe about 1.5 of me. For people who will be doing it full time.
Yeah.
There's certainly, absolutely, in Milwaukee and Wisconsin and America. There's, I think, a greater appetite for history, and part of that I think is in a reaction to the pervasiveness of change. Kind of people look back, kind of trying to maintain, kind of where the breadcrumbs, have led from, where the string is attached, and there are a lot of people exploring that. In Milwaukee's case, there's some younger people, that I try to support as best I can, but again, every generation kind of raises its own, kind of storytellers, and I've had the privilege of playing that role to some degree in Milwaukee for a long time, and somebody else will. It's just because it's too important. It's too important not to have that story kept and that story told. Right.
And part of the story of Milwaukee, and at least from what I know about it, is it's a city that's built on water a lot.
Right.
And you have wrote about that recently too.
Yeah.
Waterways.
Yep. It's called Milwaukee, a City Built on Water. Came out from the Wisconsin Historical Society Press just 2018, last year. and that was based on a lecture. It was really an ass backwards kind of a process. It began as a lecture, and then we turned it into a documentary, 1-hour documentary that still streams on Milwaukee PBS. You can go to that website and watch it 24/7.
Wow.
And then Wisconsin Historical Society Press said, "Can you turn that to a book?" And I said, "Well, it's just a TV script. It's not that long." But then it decided that there was enough to say, so kind of went back and did it's about a 50,000 word manuscript, and it turned out really well. Again, richly illustrated. My designer partner in crime has been Jim Price for the last 25 years or so. He did a really nice job of laying that out, along with Kate Hawley. And Chris Winters is just a gifted photographer. He did all the contemporary photography, so it's kind of a visual treat. It's a nice looking book.
Yeah, and I think that is what is complementary. I love like the history portion, but also everyone wants to be able to see it too.
Oh sure, absolutely.
Like see that.
Yeah, absolutely.
See it. So from that book, are there a couple things that stick out to you that people might not know about Milwaukee?
Oh, sure. Yeah, there's a lot of surprises in there. For a long time, the Milwaukee River was an open sewer. We had a couple hundred miles of sewers in the city whose only job was to convey human, animal, and industrial waste to the nearest river and just let it sit there. So during the hot days like this, you would not have wanted to been downtown. It would have just stunk to high heaven. So we were behind the curve then. Then we built the Jones Island sewage treatment plant back in 1925, and then we were ahead of the curve. And that was the biggest activated sludge treatment plant in the world at the time. Wow. So we kind of moved to the head of the parade. Also, the fact that back in those years, our ancestors had just 1 day weekend. Sunday was the only day they had off, and no air conditioning. No Hulu. No Netflix. No smartphones. So people were just desperate to have some means of recreation that was relatively cool and kind of away from these sweltering quarters. So the Milwaukee River above the North Avenue Dam for about 2 miles was lined with canoe clubs, swimming schools, amusement parks, beer gardens. I describe it as an in-town up north.
Oh, okay.
So and that was a cool period in Milwaukee's history.
Yeah.
And people are amazed. They see the pictures.
Yeah.
So they say, really?
That was there?
Yeah.
Because how is learning the history of Milwaukee? Because I'm sure you know it better than anyone else, really. How has that changed the way you look at the city? In terms of how I look at the city, part of it is as I've gotten older, it's kind of I used to think of the city in terms of the softball fields I'd played on. Then I would think of it in terms of the bars I'd been in. Sure.
And now I think of it in terms of the places I've given talks. So in all cases, it would be scores, in some cases hundreds. So that's kind of changed my perspective, or my perspective on the city has changed in that way, kind of experientially. In terms of broader themes, again, that historical imagination, and Frank Zeidler knew it better than anybody. But you'd give him, he never drove, so you get rides from people, and part of his sort of car fare was he'd sort of tell stories about the neighborhood you were going through, and he knew who lived in that place. What happened in that tavern, what the political representation there was. Yeah. So those layers were just alive to him. And as I've gotten older, I turned 72 in June, I'm accumulating layers. Okay. So I see those. I bike a lot. Yeah. I bike a lot. Before I met you, I was out at the Central Library doing research for the Around the Corner show. And I like kind of sort of digging into that research and then just biking around and kind of witnessing the city, seeing how it changes. Yeah. And that's again, informed to an important degree by what I know was there, and how things had been. Sure. Yeah. So what are you working on something specifically right now? Nothing big. I haven't taken any major projects. Commission work, I'm doing very little of that. Sure. The water book came out last year. Mm-hmm. For right now, the two things that kind of occupy me are the Around the Corner show. We're right in the middle of shooting now with John McGivern. We're in our 9th season. So getting to learn especially about the outstate communities. And I do a column once a month for the Journal Sentinel on the first Sunday of the month. It's always over-reported. I'll spend 2 days doing research and writing for a 1,200 word column that and people ask why you don't do it more often. I said I can't afford to.
Yeah.
To do that, only that I go broke.
So where can people find more about your books, more about you?
Got a website, johngurda.com, and the publications are in there, selected publications. I'm less diligent about it than I should be, but I have kind of a coming up tab, public talks.
Yeah.
I do a fair amount of talks for nonprofits or businesses, but do talks for the general public as well. Those are in there.
Well, great. Well, thank you for coming on and talking to me. I appreciate it.
Sure, Sam. Good conversation.
Yeah.